Welcome to Shamanic Voices, a podcast aimed at bringing our ancient indigenous Nordic wisdom traditions and perspectives, bringing these to bear on the challenges that we face in our modern world. I am your host, Georg, and we will often be joined by co-hosts and producers, Brian and Lori. You can find our bi-monthly episodes on most major platforms. And if you enjoy this and like to read as well, please look up our blog with dozens of articles on health-related topics at www.teutonichealing.com. And now, let's get on with our show. Welcome to Shamanic Voices, where we try to examine modern events and things that are happening in our lives, our harried, busy modern lives, in the light of ancient, ancestral, indigenous Nordic wisdom. And today we have a very special guest who will be going over with us kind of a pushback against the, well, I'll call it the allopathic tyranny, for lack of a better word, and what's been going on in our healthcare system, which is something that most of our listeners and watchers are concerned with. And Lori, would you like to make the introductions?
Oh yeah, Ashley is from Hoosiers for Medical Liberty, and she's been working to ensure that people in Indiana get to choose their own healthcare. Is that accurate, Ashley?
Yeah, we advocate for bodily integrity, which is the right to say no, or the right to refuse, whichever way you want to look at it. We work primarily in the legislature, but also educating Hoosiers or people from Indiana. For those of you who aren't from Indiana, you might not know what that is. But I am a master's prepared registered nurse. I have about 20 years of nursing experience. My heart was absolutely broken inside the hospital system, and I ended up needing to leave because I just could not handle. I felt like my soul was being sucked from my body because I could not take care of patients the way that I wanted to be. And, worked myself into a quasi-management role, developing a heart for a regional hospital. And in that process, I really saw how messed up Western medicine was. And so I ended up leaving and started practicing functional medicine, advocating for Hoosiers or people from Indiana for their right to say no to vaccines. As a nurse, I trusted the science. I was aghast when my husband suggested, probably 15, 16 years ago, that there could be something wrong with vaccines because I just couldn't understand or fathom that the medical, now I call it industry, the medical system is what I believed back then, could cause harm intentionally. And about 13 years ago, we had some situations that led to my awakening, and realizing that vaccines come with inherent risks. And so that's kind of, what started things. And then the past 5 years, just before COVID, I founded Hoosiers for Medical Liberty, which was crazy and, kind of divine intervention, put me in the right place and gave me the right tools, because I don't believe in taking action on things unless I think I can actually be successful. That's why I had to leave the hospital, because I wasn't helping, right? And being able to effectively advocate in the legislature, make change, and protect people's right to decline is such an important thing. And I'm really grateful that I'm in a position where I can do that. So
Would you help us help our audience understand the difference between what we classically think of as a genotype vaccine in the original sense, like our polio vaccines we got when we were kids, where you have a killed virus introduced to the system, versus this monstrosity, this chemical cocktail they've come up with that they're now calling a vaccine?
yeah, so there are different kinds of vaccines. When you think about traditional vaccines, there are live virus vaccines, and then there are, quote, dead vaccines. So those are the ones that have been used in the childhood schedule. And I advocate the right to say no to any of those, because there are some serious consequences. And then now, it used to be, before, they would take a virus or a bacteria, they would attenuate it, kill it, weaken it, and add different, they're called adjuvants or poisons basically, that go into the body and cause an immune response. So when you think of polio, pertussis, or also called whooping cough, when you talk about chicken pox, when you talk about so many of these different vaccines, that's the way that they do it. They bring it in, they add these poisons so that way your body will develop an immune response as a bad guy, and we need to develop antibodies and hope that that works. It was thought to be fairly effective, and in some cases it still is. The measles vaccine seems to be fairly effective at preventing measles. The pertussis vaccine, not so much. It mutes the symptoms, and that's been proven. Polio, unfortunately, is one of those that's really misunderstood. Around or less than 1% of polio cases are actually that paralytic polio that you saw. The vast majority of polio cases are what's called abortive, or meaning that there's really not any symptoms. You don't even know that you have polio. And so it's really interesting to see the way that this narrative was put into place. And we could go into a whole long discussion about polio and the issues with that vaccine. That might be for another day. But we think about where we're injecting, and people think that it's okay because it's a dead virus, but it's not just dead virus. There are things put in there intentionally to cause irritation to the body, to cause inflammation, to make your immune system have a reaction. And what we see in those cases that kids have severe reactions is that it actually agitates the immune system so much that it can cause autoimmunity, that it can cause cytokine storms or that inflammatory response. And that is some of the times where we see swelling of the brain, which can cause brain damage, which can cause symptoms like that in which we see in autism or other developmental delays. And so it's really interesting to think, everybody thinks, or a lot of people are still thinking, that the mRNA, quote, vaccines or jabs or shots, whatever you want to call them, are the main problem. But really, when we look at this whole body of vaccines, there are a lot of systemic issues. And just like with the rest of allopathic medication, they do a lot of what I like to call magic math to make things look good, but they really don't have the data, or they're not looking at the right things to tell what the hazard ratio or the rate of harm is within these vaccines. So all of that to say that the childhood vaccines aren't as safe and great as what everybody thought. And I think that people are starting to come to that realization. I have years of experience and understanding and kind of digging into this, and it was a very difficult transition as a nurse to go from believing that vaccines were safe and effective, period, to recognizing that they do sometimes cause harm, and then the stark reality of the fact that we really don't have science to show that they're safe at all. So it's hard for a lot of people to swallow. Then you take it a step further and you look at this mRNA technology, and we have no clue. I don't think we've barely scratched the surface of the damage in the way that this can impact our health. And we're seeing more and more science come out that it's not just, we know for a fact, and anybody with a background in medicine should have known that this vaccine, this injection wasn't just going to stay in the deltoid, the muscle in the arm where it was given. We know that the reason that you give injections into the muscle is because they're highly vascular. They're going to draw that up. They're going to take it systemically. And that's what we're seeing. There's a lot of information coming out from Dr. McCullough, Dr. Peter McCullough, who talks about how this is making permanent changes, how it's not only impacting the women that are being vaccinated, but it's impacting their children. And so this is, if a woman is pregnant, they are actually having the babies. I think it's a 2-year-old, or maybe it's a 4-year-old. I think it's 2 years old. There's a 2-year-old who has these You hear about those sushi clots or the
Yeah.
white fibrous, blood clots. A child who was, in utero of a mother who is vaccinated is having these things and has had chronic health issues. So it's going through that placenta that's supposed to be that protective mechanism for that baby. So we have no idea. This is going to be impacting us for generations. We're slowly going to get a little trickle. But whatever we find out, you need to assume that that's just the tip of the iceberg. And this goes so much deeper. And I don't think we'll ever truly know the impact that this has had on humanity and the trajectory of our species.
Well, various researchers around the world, including Dr. Michaela, I forget her last name, but she had a really interesting thing she did on analyzing what was in the shots. And quite a few other researchers found that there was, not only the spike protein, which I question what on earth that's going to do to help us be fighting off any particular disorder, thimerosal, which is a function of mercury. Why, mercury is not exactly good for our brain or our neural tissue. Aluminum is quite toxic inside the human body, as far as I know. Just common sense fertility, but also really disturbingly live prions, the same as cause spongiform encephalitis. And in addition to that, live AIDS virus. Now, how in the hell does it help us to be fighting off a disorder if you're going to dismantle our immune systems by basically giving everyone who got the shot AIDS? Someone would have to explain that to me.
I don't think anybody can explain it other than recognizing incompetence, right? Those spike proteins cause tons of damage and inflammation. So your body's got to repair there. And it just opens that window, whether you believe in germ theory or terrain theory.
Yep.
What a mess.
I definitely lean toward terrain theory, but when you talk about introducing spike proteins, I mean, you'd have to recognize that they're going to be shutting down the fine capillaries of the brain. And one of the most common things I've run into with patients post-vaccine, where we're dealing with the after effects, is a lot of brain fog and a greatly impaired memory. I mean, within 2 to 3 months of getting the vaccination.
The thing I struggle with the most with the whole production of spike protein, and we know that this is the way that they designed these shots, is to go in there and teach the body. That's what mRNA is, messenger RNA. So it's giving your body these instructions to create this spike protein.
Right.
And I've said this from the beginning. As soon as I heard about this, and as soon as I started seeing all of the cardiac effects, and it was long before it was ever reported in the news, because I still have a lot of contacts. My old office partner, the one that I helped create the heart failure program with, she was talking to me. I was watching her kids because obviously school was shut down. And she was talking to me about all of these things as the vaccine came out and whatnot. And I just thought how much of these muscles have taken up that mRNA, how many of these sites are creating spike protein, and how long will they be creating spike protein. So the dose, the amount of spike protein that we're creating within a body to develop immunity potentially, right, is completely unknown. Dose and duration are two of the most important things that we think about when we talk about pharmaceutical interventions.
Well, does spike protein in and of itself, like what is it called, Virovax? There's one that's just pure spike protein. That's a separate injection. I don't know what the heck that's designed for, but I mean, would that actually, if I had that in my system, prevent me from getting any particular influenza strain? Would the presence of spike protein in my body prevent me from getting any particular disorder?
If it would anything, it would be whatever the spike protein is attached to, which would be SARS-CoV-2 or those thereafter. But again, when we get into the nitty-gritty of this, these viruses change all the time. They mutate and they grow. And we gave this to tons and tons of people. We watched as we then Omicron came and swept through. And
Right.
viruses are designed, and again, whether you believe in terrain theory or germ theory, a combination thereof. I think it has to kind of be a combination because these things are present. We know that they're there. It's just when they're activated and able to overcome the defense mechanism, the immune system, it is the problem. And we saw the way that COVID rapidly changed, and Omicron came out and hit everybody really hard. So is it going to work? Is it going to be effective? Probably not. And we've seen that with all of the quote breakthrough infections. You have all these people who've been vaccinated. My sister is vaccinated, and she's gotten multiple, not just the first, series, but she's gotten multiple since then. She's had COVID more than the rest of our family.
Well, I remember as a child being given the measles vaccine, and surely enough, this really strange thing happened after getting the vaccine. You didn't get measles. So, it did what it was supposed to do. Whereas with this, they're selling us on the idea that, well, you'll go on and get it, but it won't be as severe a case.
Yeah, you're not as likely to be hospitalized, and you're not as likely to die. How can you measure that? There's no possible way to measure that.
Now, did you hear this research in Australia, which was actually presented in front of the Australian Parliament? I wish I could quote the individual who found it, but they had a batch of this Pfizer and Moderna vaccine in a medical transshipment place, warehouse, whatever it was, and just passing by doing a normal radiological sweep, because I think they had radiological elements in there as well. They found that they got a huge hit on the cabinet that had the vaccines in it, okay, the so-called vaccines. Well, they started testing them individually and found that they had 56 different radiological elements. Now, what is the purpose of putting heavy radiological elements into a vaccine?
That's another thing, that's really complex and interesting. We don't know what all goes in, and the production is different each time. Like every time you make a batch of cookies, if you're to make a batch of cookies, it's not exactly the same. And vaccines are similar. There are contaminants, there are certain amounts, and they're not testing for these things. And so how that got there would be really interesting to dive into and look at. And I had not heard that. But there are so many different variables that could play into what's in that vaccine, just like we talk about with childhood vaccines, DNA contaminants.
I guess what really got my attention when these came out was the fact, and I saw some actually film strips of people showing that the little MSRP, which should tell you exactly what's in a particular item that you're supposed to take, whether it's a cough syrup or even aspirin. I mean, it's got a little data sheet. The data sheet was there, and it was all blank paper. I thought that was really interesting. Like, we have no obligation to tell you what's in this whatsoever. Take it on blind faith. I'm going, what? I know there's something fishy about that from the get-go.
Take it on blind faith. And that was part of the PrEP Act and the emergency use authorization. They consider all that information proprietary information. Wow. And it's crazy because I don't know that any of those vaccine inserts are updated yet. I don't know that any of them have, and I have not looked, but it would be interesting to see the date of this, recording at the end of June in 2025 to see if any of the vaccine inserts are actually printed and provided. But patients don't see those. Your doctor is not going to give that to you. Your pharmacist is not going to give that to you. You might be lucky to get what is called a vaccine information sheet, a VIS, but it's very generic and it does not go over the ingredients. It does not go over the potential side effects. And clearly, we've not tested these. The new iterations of these jabs, vaccines, whatever you want to call them, have not been tested to a placebo. It's going off of the studies and the information from the last one and comparatively, or with a small number of animals, which is completely frightening.
Now, didn't I understand that as of, 2020 or was it 2021, all new vaccines come out will be mRNA? No?
Not yet. They're going to shift to that. It's really interesting. There's a lot of things happening. It goes back to 2019. They were looking for a universal flu vaccine. And what they were saying is that this is laying the groundwork for mRNA or even DNA vaccines. What they want to be able to do is to print a patch, to use kind of like a 3D printer and be able to print a patch and vaccinate people. And they want it to be more responsive. And so that way it doesn't have, like, every year you have to get a different flu vaccine. They have to guess at the strains that are going to be most prominent. And then they have to hope that the virus strains that they chose aren't just different enough that the vaccine won't work. And so they want to make it so it works on a different part of the virus that doesn't really change. And it's really interesting to see how this is moving. I really think that part of this COVID pandemic, whatever you want to call it, was so that way they could advance this technology. And there's a video, I can't remember where it aired, but Anthony Fauci, oh man, his name is escaping me. He worked for BARDA. He is the one that talked about the winter of death. I cannot remember his name for the life of me, but they were on this briefing or panel, and they were talking about creating this universal flu vaccine and how they needed an infusion of excitement and money into vaccine research so that way they could create this universal vaccine. And everything that they talked about, COVID-19 did. And it infused massive amounts of taxpayer dollars, global funds into this vaccine research to advance the science. Because as they talked about, this mRNA technology has been around. The theory and the work on it has been around for like 30 years, but it's not been able to be pushed out there. There are still so many issues with it. And I think because of the pushback, they've not really launched. And I don't think that they're seeing efficacy or, it working in a lot of the vaccines that they're trying, because I really anticipated them to have a flu, pneumonia and COVID combo shot, mRNA combo shot. So far, I've not seen any influenza vaccines come out that are mRNA. We see the RSV is out there. But aside from that, I haven't seen anything. And I really thought that we would have already seen that transition, because they should, in theory, be able to just take that, the viral code and plug it into the mRNA and turn around.
Weren't they actually just using a simulation of what the virus should look like without actual live samples to come up with this in the first place?
It's the coding, I believe.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. This is a computer simulation. This wasn't even working off a real virus.
Yeah, which
theoretical background to come up with was just violated what Jean-Luc Montagnier said the way a viral countermeasure should be constructed. Of course, he mysteriously kind of died shortly after making that statement. Funny how that works.
It is funny how that works, isn't it? But live virus vaccines are pretty dangerous because of the fact that there's a list of compensatable reactions. The government, because manufacturers of vaccines do not have liability. The manufacturers of childhood schedule vaccines do not have liability. So if you are injured, you cannot go and directly sue Merck or GlaxoSmithKline or whatever. You have to go sue HHS and try to prove your case. And they have a list of specific vaccine injuries or adverse events that are compensatable. And for live virus vaccines like measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, used to be shingles, but that's no longer live virus. But the live virus vaccines can cause those illnesses, because if we go back to the idea, you have a weakened, or they call attenuated virus, where it's still alive. If that person's immune system is weakened,
why can't it mutate into something more potent? Exactly.
But, yeah, and you see kids that get the measles rash. They don't call it the measles. And that is a compensatable adverse event on.
Now, isn't VAERS a very difficult thing for prescribers, for practitioners to even fill out the form? I mean, it's very awkward, and clumsy, so that it discourages reporting. I don't think we're getting true reporting of the sheer numbers of persons injured, are we?
We're not. And I have actually created a continuing education for nurses on the vaccine adverse event reporting system, also known as VAERS. It's estimated that, and there are two research studies that I can cite, one from 2010, one from 2015, I think, that showed that reporting is around 1% to
That's what I
VAERS, the
heard.
vaccine. Yeah, less than 1% actually with the first study. And then the second study that uses that same system created by Harvard with $1 million grant. So Harvard, you think of the most prestigious medical school in the United States with the brightest people. They developed this program. They put it together so that way, CDC can see how well VAERS is being used, and it comes back with less than 1% of adverse events.
Participation. Well, let me ask you this. We were speaking about magic math, and I think there's some other magic math we need to look at here, which is the persons dying after receiving the vaccine never seem to die of vaccine reaction. They die of, let's see, myocarditis or pneumonia or whatever. No one ever seems to put it together. Gee, if you block the alveoli with lots and lots of spike protein, that just could kind of interfere with your ability to get oxygen. You could get hypoxic as a result, and you could have edema in the lungs, as pulmonary edema is a secondary complication. I mean, this is just basic medical knowledge that would happen, and yet there's never a linkage. They simply, is this a rule? How is this enforced? Because nobody is reporting the actual linkage between or very little of it's being reported, getting the vaccine and then dying of something predictable as a result.
Yeah, it's absolutely mind-blowing. And this has been a problem in healthcare for a long time. We think about medical malpractice. We talk about polypharmacy or the use of multiple medications. And so it's not something that's, it happens. It happened before COVID. It's just insane when you think about chemotherapy, when you think about antidepressants, when you think about statins for cholesterol. These people, it's absolutely mind-blowing when you think about it. But what has systemically happened, and I think that this was what people need to understand, these were not just independent groups of people deciding what they were going to do in the hospitals. This came from the government. These were edicts, passed down. You don't talk about this, you will lose your job, you will lose funding. There were pathways for incentivization, and there have always been pathways of incentivization for vaccinations. When I worked for the hospital, part of our reimbursement was based on the rate of employment of employee vaccinations. When I worked at the insurance company, part of our reimbursement was based on the number of our patients that were vaccinated. And so these things trickle down from on high, and then you have a choice. You sit down, you shut up, and you follow orders, or you get fired.
Well, let's talk about who gives the orders, shall we?
I mean, do you want to add in? Or
well, who gains from this? I mean, the theory is that all these folks get together and they have several meetings. They have what they call, tabletop exercises, the Gates Foundation. They start having these back in the early years of the century, 2005 and onward, some even earlier, kind of figuring out, well, what would happen if we had this massive virus, this pandemic? How much population would we lose? All of this. I mean, to what extent do the fingerprints of genocide appear on this phenomenon?
So I just want to say that these thoughts are my own and not that of Hoosiers for Medical Liberty or any of my associates. I have a book written by Bill Gates, How to Prevent the Next Pandemic. He lays it all out perfectly. And the fact that you talk about the tabletop exercises, I don't know who all is included. There are a lot of people probably behind closed doors, but Bill Gates is a huge proponent of this, just like he's a huge proponent of mass sterilization through HPV vaccine in third world countries. I mean, this was one of the hardest things for me to swallow as a nurse, because I didn't become a nurse because I wanted the money. I didn't become a nurse because I thought it was fashionable. I want to love on people. I want to help them live the best quality life that they can live. And we see this constant bastardization and weaponization of medicine. And it really makes you wonder, when did it go off the rails, and can we ever actually put it back on? Because we have people like Bill Gates, people like, the World Economic Forum, and all of these major, very well-funded organizations, and mostly tying back to Bill Gates, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Gavi, all of these things that are driving the bus, forcing these changes throughout our government, throughout insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, pharmaceutical industry, and they're making all of this money. And you think, how do we combat this?
Well, our life expectancy in this country has gone down considerably, a number of years since the mass COVID vaccinations. The same thing has happened in Australia and New Zealand, where likewise they've had an even higher number of persons forcibly vaccinated. And I think the worst case of all, I don't know if you've been following it or not, is the disappearance of about 2/3 of the population of the People's Republic of China, which was the most draconianly vaccinated population on the planet, as in 89% of them. And I think the only exceptions were pretty much the Chinese military was left out because they wanted them intact. Okay, which is interesting.
The best part of that statement, and I guess I didn't realize this, and I haven't followed what's happening over in China, but when you talk about how in the US, it's inverse, right? The military, the medical professionals, all of our public servants, they're the ones being forced
Yes,
vaccinated.
that's right.
And over in China,
It's been
they're
the
being
opposite.
preserved.
That's right. The peasants are the ones being, culled, so to speak. I think that's the only way you can call it. And of course, we have the mass number of, what do they call it? Excess deaths in Europe that's being noticed by actuaries, which is continuing to build. And the number of live births has greatly decreased. The number of miscarriages has greatly increased. So as far as women's health, there's clearly an impact here. I mean, if and hasn't spike protein been found? Isn't one of the first places it goes if you're really young and in the childbearing and child making ages? It goes straight to the reproductive parts of male and female and kind of sterilizes both parties.
Yeah. I mean, we know that those spike proteins are going in there. And what does inflammation do? It causes a bunch of scarring. We've seen this historically. All of these women facing fertility treatments or undergoing fertility treatments, it's a lot of it because of scarring and the inability of the egg to actually, come out of the ovary. And we're seeing more and more of that. And that is exactly what has happened. I actually have Naomi Wolf's book.
Yes, yes.
And the way that it shows the pictures and the distribution of the spike protein, looking at all these studies, that is absolutely a massive problem. And when you think about it, our population is in decline. People aren't having as many kids. They've waited quite a long time to have kids, which of course impacts especially female fertility. And this is a huge issue because
I had a nice young couple come to me about this infertility problem, and we've worked on that sometimes with people successfully. And they're both now 38 years old. They felt it was their last shot. They'd both been tested to see if they were suitable for parenthood a couple of years ago. They're both college professors, and we're just getting to that point like, okay, now finally we've got everything in order. We've got our house in order. We've got our careers where they're supposed to be, et cetera. Now we can do this. And prior to that, when they were tested, she was producing eggs. He was producing sperm, no problem. As of starting to try about a year ago, they wondered what was wrong, went to an infertility clinic and found out she's not producing eggs. He's almost sperm free. And what little he has, there's no motility. So this was a complete shift. And they're both really healthy young people, exercise, organic diet, the whole bit, don't smoke, don't drink. You just couldn't explain this away. That was like turning off a switch after taking the COVID vaccinations, which were forced on them by their own government.
That's what I was going to ask, is if they were vaccinated. And it's insane to see that shift from, what did you say, 2 years?
Yeah, correct.
Wow.
Correct.
I can't help but think, and have thought this quite a bit. Our species is really in trouble, not just because of the fertility damage, but because of the fact that we're going to pass this down. We know that this has made changes in our DNA, and I can't help but think about all the poor souls in IVF clinics that have been frozen in time. I have some family members who have adopted embryos and have beautiful children because, of the result of that. And I kind of think, oh my goodness, could all of these babies that are just kind of like out there in limbo be the saving grace? Because I've thought for a long time, there's a movie called Children of Men. And the premise of the movie is basically like the world has become barren. There are no more reproducing females. And it basically prevented a whole generation from having children. And then this girl becomes pregnant, and the movie is showing her. It's a small group of people trying to protect this young woman who becomes pregnant because it's a miracle, and the world finds out, and everybody is just so invested in this pregnancy, and everybody wants to see a pregnant woman and they want to see a baby. And I'm thinking, is this what's going to happen? Could these IVF babies be what helps continue our species on? But then I think
I
about,
don't think you'll have to worry about that. This is a matter of population replacement. This is a matter of a mass genocide of particular people. You see, it was concentrated heavily in the Western world. It was concentrated heavily in China for whatever reason, perhaps because there were so many of them, 1.3 billion at one point. Definitely not there now. There's a Chinese statistician who goes into all of in fact, she uses a lot of very interesting measures, like how much salt they're using, which is, of course, a major part of the human diet. They're importing an amount of salt presently, which they import all of it from Japan. And she was able to track this, equivalent to about 300 million Chinese, the actual salt requirements for that many for healthy salt use. Okay, so it's gone down. We don't know where the exact amount because the government's completely secretive about it, but it's considerably fewer people, at least half the number of people that were there at one time. Whole villages, areas that used to be crowded, no longer are. And of course, here's what we also know is that as a result of the Gates Foundation doing their dirty business by pretending to give polio shots, et cetera, in Africa, only about 6% of Africans were vaccinated. The same pushback against them has occurred in India. They tried to forcibly vaccinate. Most people resisted. And interestingly enough, in our own country, guess who didn't get forcibly vaccinated? Even at the height of the hysteria, anybody slithering across the border did not get vaccinated. Isn't that interesting? So here comes the replacement population from all over the third world. Areas where, I'm sorry to say this, but it's true, the average IQ is somewhere around 75 to 80, and they're coming in to replace those of us who were forced to take the vaccine in order to keep our jobs.
yeah,
If that happened to else, it would be called genocide.
it should be. It should be called genocide. I mean, my grandpa was in Auschwitz, and I very much knew and understood based on his stories what was happening and how things went about. And I recognize very much of that same propaganda and pull. My favorite, not favorite, but the war that I studied the most was World War II, because one grandpa was in Auschwitz and my other grandpa was in the South Pacific fighting in the Army Air Corps. And so there's a lot of family history there, and it's really interesting to hear those different dynamics. Because it was two very different fights, right?
Yes, it was.
And
Yeah.
two very different perspectives. So when you look at the psychology of all of it, it should be called genocide. That's what it is. And I don't know that, these third world countries, what are they going to do next to wipe out that population?
Well, I don't think they're going to. I think the controlling elites, the cryptocracy, if you will, think that they're simply a more governable, more docile, more controllable peasant population, while the few elite up here, perhaps they have an antidote for their own vaccinations, or maybe they just don't take them. I've tried to work that out myself. What is really the case here? Do they just pretend to take it? I don't know.
I think that there are some that probably weren't privy to the information and took it. And the ones that, Bill Gates, I don't think him and his family would take it. I don't think anybody that goes to Davos is actually taking these things, you know.
So you would
Um,
have this tiny little upper class and they'd have a large slave class under them. That's the way I think they look at it. Not
I'm
my point of
sure
view, but I think it's their point of view. I think it is very much like the Third Reich. You're not wrong to make that comparison. In fact, wasn't that one of the protocols that came out at the end of World War II? The what are they called? Named after the Nuremberg Accords. That's what it was called. And the U.S.
yeah.
was a signatory to that. So the U.S. by treaty agreed that we won't forcibly vaccinate. I mean, that is a treaty we signed. I think 1947. You're aware of that, right?
Oh, yes. Well, I think the way that the workaround on that was the fact that it wasn't the government forcibly vaccinated a small number of people through mandates at a job. But what our legislators consistently told us was, you don't have to take it, but there are consequences to your actions. And if you don't take it, you're not going to have a job and you're going to lose your pension and
Mhm.
yada, yada, yada. So I think that is the way that they did that, because people still, quote, consented, despite the fact that that consent cannot be given under that level of duress and coercion.
I
And
think when you have coercion, you don't have consent. I'm sorry, but you're
right.
just wrong.
Yeah, I agree to that. So they're using those play on words, and they're able to manipulate things and say, well, we didn't force people to get it. We just, had to have rules for your protection. Um,
Apropos to all of this morning, synchronistically enough, I was listening to John G. Wells' Caravan to Midnight. I don't know if you ever hear him or not. And he was interviewing Sean Burkholder or something like that. Anyway, the National Citizens Inquiry.ca, a Canadian group that's doing exactly what you guys are doing. And they were saying that in Canada, it's even worse than the US, that there's this big pushback by their FDA against all natural cures, even if, like, ginger tea has been used for indigestion for thousands of years by people in many different continents. And now suddenly you would have to get a doctor's permission to have ginger tea. I mean, if you follow the logic of the laws they're coming up with. And of course, they report nothing but the issues with these natural cures, because the FDA is 100% owned by the pharmaceutical industry. They never report the benefits of these natural cures. It's completely lopsided and highly inaccurate and dishonest.
well, it's not patentable.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
But you want to really talk about genocide. If you look at what's happening in Canada, and it's surprisingly out in the open. Have you heard of their MAID program?
Yes, I have, where basically the person drowns on their own fluids over a long period of time while they're
No.
paralyzed. Yeah.
The MAID program is actually medically aided dying.
Yes, correct.
And so I don't know that they're necessarily allowing, I don't think they're allowing them to suffer. I think that they have effective euthanasia for humans, but a lot of these Canadian citizens, they're on socialized medicine. They're
Actually, I
on,
heard an MD talking about it, that the way this would work, if you're a Canadian vet who, for example, is suffering from depression, well, you should just go on and off yourself. We'll help you do it painlessly. But in reality, it paralyzes you and you start building up fluid in the lungs and you kind of drown slowly over a period of hours, which has got to be horrendous. It's not a quick and instant death. It is a slow, excruciating thing, but you're paralyzed and you can't struggle against it.
the things that I have seen is more what's in front of that. What happens before? You have these patients who are on, taxpayer dollars is what's taking care of their medicine. They have to wait an extremely long period of time before they can access care, before they can see a doctor. Once they see a doctor, they're again punted. So their treatment, or their, like, a one lady was talking about how she needs a wheelchair to be able to get around, to have some semblance of an active lifestyle. And it's going to be years before she can get that. And she's already waited quite a long time, or maybe it was a wheelchair lift. So that way she can get in and out of her apartment or home or whatever.
Right.
But the caseworker who's talking with her about these things says, well, that we could have you maid services, this assisted death, murder, within 2 weeks.
No waiting line for that. Yeah.
No waiting in line, just no problem. We'll send somebody out. And they're saying now that kids can do this. And they have this massive population of vaccine injured. These people who have all of these, I don't know if you watch or have seen Bree Dressen's story with the trials that she's gone through. We have a couple people here in Indiana and Ohio who have severe muscle spasms and twitches. I mean, their body is just constantly in this state of motion. And so you have all of these kids, and they're saying that kids can now, quote, consent to maid services.
When we say kids, how young are we talking about here?
I want to say it's 13. I'm not sure if they're going below that, but, and don't quote me on that, please. It would have to be researched because I don't have that in front of me. I didn't expect this to turn into that conversation, but they're saying that kids can consent, quote, consent to maid services. And that's an option. You know, depression is even something that you can seek out maid services for.
That's what I'm saying. For sure, depression is a cause for using maids.
I cannot get over. I can't get over treating adults in that manner. But to coerce and end the lives of children after you cause the problem.
So is what we're talking about here when we look at this whole big picture. I know you believe in higher powers, and so do I. Is this we would call them reptilian, you might call them satanic, I wouldn't disagree with that term, force behind the medical care system, quote, care, end quote, that we presently have that's doing this massive damage to the human population globally? I mean, how else can you put it?
Can we take a second and just look at Bill Gates?
Okay.
Does that answer your question? I think that your listeners will get the nuance to that. I mean, pure evil, you know, whatever you want to call it, it doesn't matter what you call it. Pure evil and corruption and hatred and selfishness. I think those are all things that we can agree are part of that.
I think in their worldview, they only need a small technical class to keep the robots going, replace 90% at least of what's being done with human labor presently with automation. You know, even the mowing lawn being done by robots, the cleaning of your floors being done by robots, etc.
It's really interesting. I have a hard time putting my mindset in that of these types of people just because I truly cannot understand it. Part of the beauty of life is enjoying it with amazing people, having conversations.
I quite agree.
You know, understanding each other and the way that we bring more beauty to the world, right?
Yes.
We are definitely, and I might get in trouble in some circles for saying this, we are definitely herd animals, right? We're supposed to be together. We're supposed to interact. And so what are they going to do with all this land and resources? And I think for those of us that believe in a higher power and that, you know, there is something after this earthly life, you know, it's all temporary. So having control over it, you're just going to die anyways. Like,
kind of reminds you of those people who rush past you at 80 miles an hour on the way to wait at the same traffic light you're going to at 45, you know. They end up at the same destination, right? Don't they?
Yep. It's so funny.
Indeed. I guess they're thinking that the fewer people there are for the same amount of resources, then they're all even richer than they were. I guess that's their logic. I don't know.
The thing that, this is kind of getting off topic, but the thing that kills me about all of this is it's after the resources. The average person doesn't need a whole lot. And we think about, everybody wants to talk about scarcity of resources. And I push back because I look, as I'm driving around, we have all this land that's wasted with yard, that's wasted with like the grassy areas in between all of these exit ramps and everything like this. We should not have a lack of food or nutrition because we have all these places that can produce. And I know that your faith base is very much rooted in nature. But if we would simply be good stewards of our earth and treat it well, we would see the most amazing things happen, and we wouldn't have to be worried about the scarcity of resources.
Well, this is an artificial scarcity. I know it's, again, not specifically our topic for today, but all the deliberate destruction of our food processing plants, our food storage plants, our food distribution machinery, all of this has come under attack for the last several years. There's some guy who has actually a map of it I've seen on internet, and it's just amazing. It's all over the country. To drive food prices up is one obvious thing, but also just creating an artificial scarcity.
Yeah, it's a means of control, and I think we realize that. Most people realize that a lot of this artificial scarcity, that's a great way to put it, is a means of control. And I think, and this is an idea that I've had for several years now since COVID, I would love to see the victory garden come back. I would love to see people, you have a bunch of regenerative farming, you have permaculture that's really kind of, becoming hip and popular. And to think about the kind of good that we could do, like we could do so much good if we just let go of these preconceived notions that we can't.
You're right. We could plant moringa trees in our yards instead of grass, and every part of the plant can be eaten, used in one way or the other.
Yeah, or herbs, roots,
Yes,
I mean, berries. Think about how wonderful it would be.
Dwarf fruit trees, a lot of things that we could do in that same space.
Yeah, and we would have such a biodiverse community. You'd be able to enjoy the birds, butterflies would make, anyways, yes, all the things.
I can share the same vision with you there. I do totally agree with that. That makes sense.
I think it's beautiful how we came to this conversation when we came in on such a dark place, the destruction of humanity, and here we're talking about hope for changing and creating more beautiful things in our world.
Well, my concern is, having heard that thing today with that Canadian group, that our FDA is not too far behind. They've been trying to do it ever since, what was that guy, Kessler was his name, under Clinton, who was trying to crack down on all kinds of health food stores, shut them down, basically make everything where if you wanted to get acerola cherry for vitamin C when you have a cold, you would have to get a doctor's prescription for it. So that little bottle of acerola cherry that now costs you $20 would cost you $250 for your 5 minutes with the medical divinity to give you permission to get that. When he sees you sniffle and says, "Oh, yeah, you've got a cold. Okay, here's your script." It would reduce everything to that. It would shut down our access to anything but prescription medicines and a few OTCs owned by the same people, of course.
Yeah, and those herbals come without the side effects.
Oh, they're totally out to get rid of the herbal cures completely.
Well, I think that's why they don't like them. Yeah, because you can't make money off of a healthy person. When you give a pharmaceutical for an ailment, you're making money, plus you're making a perpetual customer.
Yep.
And that's part of the design with these vaccinations and even the childhood vaccination schedule. You're making a perpetual customer.
Well, it's also the idea, and you notice I had a patient who is an MD, and she was telling me that, you would get run out of, you would not finish your program if you talk about curing anything. That when you're in medical school, you use the word manage. Here's how we manage this. Here's how we manage that. You manage the illness because there really is a lot of pressure on them. And so she said that's the reason that prescription medicines are really, really weak. They're not actually designed to get rid of that which they're against. They're there to suppress the symptoms to a minor extent so that you can live with it more manageably, but never enough to actually get rid of it. And I thought that was interesting. Even if you went back to the 19th century, even prescriptions were designed to actually get rid of it. You have disease X, we're going to get rid of, we're going to cure you. You move on, hopefully you don't get another disease. Now it's no, we don't want you to get rid of it. We'll manage it. You'll come in 4 times a year for a checkup. There's your, $1,000 worth of visits to the doctor's office for 3 or 4 minutes with him or her. And all these prescriptions in between that you and or your insurer pay for. Of course, you're paying your insurance company, so you're paying for it either way. Just a deferred payment or a direct payment, but
Sometimes both.
Sometimes both. Yeah. Yeah.
And for our aging population, a lot of times it's both. They're paying, or they've paid this whole time into Medicare, and then they're still having co-pays and astronomical costs. Because when I worked at the insurance company, it was devastating to me to watch these patients. And I had wonderful success because I worked a lot with diet and lifestyle modifications, was able to do amazing things, especially with my diabetics and my chronic pain patients, because of the fact that we could work on these modifiable factors. And they were saving so much money on their medications. They were just elated. It's absolutely insane. They no longer had to choose between food and medicine. They were using their food as medicine.
Well, Dr. William Lee, LI, has published books on that and has YouTube videos on it. Does a really good job of showing the link between the two. Of course, he's very, very careful to say, well, take this and it will help you to tolerate your chemotherapy better, et cetera. He's definitely very careful not to come out against the current regimen, which
FDA
I'm sure he
will
has
snatch your license right out from underneath you.
Oh, they surely would. Yeah. So I don't know what we do to get out of this tyranny. I see we are going into a situation. I think the U.S. right now, as I understand it, is still the only Western country, the only, you might say, G7 or probably even G20 country where you can freely get supplements.
Wow.
That's shocking.
Yeah, that is. I think that as much as I hate politics, and I never intended to get involved in politics, we all have to shake off our political apathy. And we must get involved. We must have these conversations, and we need to stop accepting what we're given. We have to refuse. And when we put those principles into action, that's what makes Hoosiers for Medical Liberty so successful, is because we're done playing the games. I'm actually writing a book right now, or just finishing up. It's called Resuscitating Nursing. And I'm teaching nurses how to do this, because I do believe that on the whole, medical providers are not there. Medical professionals are not there because they want the money. Some of them are 100%. But usually there is some sort of impetus, or at least there used to be some sort of impetus which brought them there. And so teaching people how to engage and be active in politics without becoming eaten up by the system is going to be necessary. And I think that's how we end this medical and overall tyranny. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to come on and have this conversation. I'd love to continue it.
Well, I'd love to do a second part with you. I think all we have to fight back with, they've got all the money. All we got to fight back with is our votes, to say, we will not vote for you if you're in the pocket of Big Pharma, period. We want to know where it's coming. I loved it when, who was it? There was interviewing, oh, I know what it was. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., very sharp guy. And he's talking with Bernie Sanders and who's that other clown, Elizabeth Warren. And he actually stands up and says, well, sir, didn't you take 1.5 million from Big Pharma just this year? And he did the same thing with her, and they got outraged, but it was just so transparent that these are tools being used by the plutocracy.
He actually did that today. He was presenting
Okay.
He not to them, but to a different person. He was presenting his budget, and I'm going to pull a clip, and I'll have to make sure I send it to Lori or send it to you so that way you guys can watch it. Maybe we'll do a second part soon. But he called somebody out in a hearing, and the Democrats lost their minds and said, he's impugning his reputation. He must retract those words. And he ended up retracting them. But there was a little smirk in his eyes when he did it, because he's like, it doesn't matter if I retract them or not. It's out there. The people know, and now they can react. So that's what everybody needs to do. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you.
Well, thank you. Enjoyed having you, and you're welcome back anytime. And best of luck to Hoosiers for is it Health Liberty or
Medical Liberty?
It's a great program. I'd like to see that in every state. Well, folks, this has been Shamanic Voices. Thank you to our guest for her very knowledgeable content and explaining the details of the current medical system. And as always, look at our blog. We have over 80 articles on all kinds of medical and health related topics. We have, I think this is our 32nd podcast, so we're tooling right along with that, and we'll try to keep it interesting. And until then, go with the gods. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Shamanic Voices. Please like and subscribe so that you won't miss our coming episode, where we always try to have engaging and interesting topics and or guests. Thank you, and go with the gods.